Hi guys. You know, when I started this podcast, I kind of alluded to the fact that I'd be taking you on a Cliff Notes version of the book. And the more we've spent time in this thing, it's turning out to be quite an expansion of the book, which is okay. It's just the more that I prepare for these podcasts and new understandings open up, built upon things that I've already learned and shared in the book. It's just been amazing, the things that have come. Well, my name's Marc Paladino, and this is Reexamining the End Times. I'm glad you could be with us today. And we are studying Matthew 24 at the moment, the Olivet Discourse, which is found in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. We're discussing the discourse about Jesus's signs that he gave his disciples about his return and about the end of the age and the destruction of the temple, and going through some various aspects of that. To this point, we've examined the cultural and historical contexts of the discourse. We've seen how the disciples had a particular conception, their worldview on what Messiah's return would look like. We've seen a sampling of biblical and historical data that indicates the time of fulfillment of what Jesus was talking about would be there in the first century within the generation of those listening. He wanted to make sure his disciples were not deceived by false prophets and false messiahs claiming to be great deliverers. And this all added up to a kind of a recalibration of their understanding of Messiah's place. And we'll get into this a little bit more down the road, but as we had spoken, that they understood that Messiah was going to disappear for a couple of months, and according to rabbinical teaching, and return as a conquering hero. And Jesus kind of dispels all that, saying, no, that's not how I'm coming back. And he certainly wasn't coming back from heaven in 2,000 or 3,000 years. These disciples had no concept of that idea of Messiah flying off to heaven and then coming back 2,000 years later to end the world. That was nothing in the Jewish worldview that would support that kind of idea. And we looked at some examples through the scriptures of how the disciples before this discourse didn't understand that Jesus was going to die and resurrect, and then after this discourse, they still didn't understand that he was going to die and resurrect. So it seems kind of odd that we would think that they would be asking him about his return from heaven at the end of the world. No, they asked him about the end of the age, and that age was the age of the law of Moses. It was the Olam Hazah, as they understood, as we understand in Hebrew, and they were looking forward to the Messianic age, or the Olam Haba, the age to come, and Messiah's reign and rule and defeat of his enemies, their enemies, would occur as the hinge point between those two ages. And so we've proposed now that Jesus' his prophecy was not about the end of the world, but about the end of the Jewish age. And we must now, considering that idea, we must really account for the very dramatic language that we see in this text about how Jesus is going to be return. And he talks about this great tribulation, and he talked about lightning from east to west. And we had a chance to see in the last couple episodes how that is not to be interpreted just by human reason or human imagination, but our interpretation of these things must be biblically informed. And we saw how in the kings that both Hezekiah and Josiah were mentioned as the greatest king ever, and in the lightning from east to the west, we saw in Ezekiel how that was derived out of a prophecy in Ezekiel about God's sword of judgment polished to flash like lightning going from the east to the west. And I encourage you to go back, if you haven't seen those, just take a look at those podcasts, because I think they can be very, very informative. And I want to stress the fact, as a lot of people, expositors stress the idea of literal interpretation. Well, that may be true in certain things, but these events are literal. What we're describing is very literal, but they're being described in a symbolic manner. They're being described with the imaginative, poetic form of the ancient East and of the ancient Israelite prophets. And so we'll look at that a little bit more closely here tonight, today. But I want to move on. We're now arriving here at about Matthew 24, and we're going to pick this up at verse 29. So because again we're talking about some dramatic language here, and so we want to read from Matthew 24. I thought I had myself turned to it, but apparently I didn't. In Matthew 24, in we're going to read right through from 29 to 35, I think, just to get some larger context. And then we probably won't cover all of that in this session. It's probably going to take a couple of sessions. I want to tell you, I've just seen some really incredible things. I can't stress to you enough how our interpretation, how we must let Scripture interpret Scripture, how our interpretation must be biblically informed. And if we see in these texts that we're going to read here how they are biblically informed, how Jesus interpreted various texts from the Old Testament to describe what is going on here, I think it might surprise you, because we haven't this idea that Jesus coming and the moon turning to blood and the stars falling from heaven and all that has to do with literal events that are ending the world. And nowhere in biblical history is the end of the world ever described in that kind of language, okay? And so it means, this language means something completely different, okay? And so we want to understand that. If we're going to understand biblical prophecy, we've got to get out of this wooden literalism and look at how Jesus, is the incarnation. Jesus was God-man, is God-man. And so as a Jewish man in the first century, he used these same linguistic conventions, we'll call them, literary styles or linguistic or language styles that were common to the people of his day and common to their scriptures of the Old Testament, okay? And so this is what Jesus is using. And so these texts are going to be biblically informed. They're not, the interpretation is not going to be hatched from a fevered imagination, nor were they given out of Jesus's, I think I'll describe it this way. No, he's using biblical sources from the Torah, from what the Jews call the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, the law or the teaching, the prophets and the writings to inform his teaching and his prophecy, and so we need to understand that. And so we read in Matthew 24 and 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days. Now let's stop there right away. Immediately after the tribulation. Now we established last time that the tribulation of those days was in fact in the time of the Jewish Roman war in the 1st century AD, and the whole planetary convulsion that was going on throughout the empire with wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and all kinds of convulsions going on. And then this entering into this time of tribulation and horror during the Jewish-Roman war. And again, I remind you, we're talking about a historical events, not an indictment against the Jewish people today. And again and again and again, I want to make that clear. So Jesus says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, as a matter of fact, the Greek text uses the word ekinos, which is those self-same days. It's not days like this, or that this is something that's a common occurrence that happens all the time throughout history. Jesus says those specific days. Ekinos it has a certain level of specificity. Those self-same days, precisely those days. He says that the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the heavens, the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, or that is, the tribes of the land will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. And then he goes on to say, from the fig tree learn this lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near, even at the very gates. I say to you, this is such an important verse, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And then he says, heaven and earth will pass away better. The heaven and the land, and I'll explain that, will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And again, we have this second half of the bookends, the inclusio that we've been talking about, that begins in Matthew 23:36, that Jesus says all these things will come upon this generation. Then he closes this section of signs with the fact that this generation will not pass away until these things happen. Okay, and so we have everything in this context is within this inclusio, within these bookends, that if this is something that's going to happen, was going to happen in the lifetime of the disciples, or at least in the generation of the disciples. And so we have to account for what this might mean, and we can't do it just with, well, obviously the world didn't collapse when in the first century the entire universe didn't collapse, which is what seems to be described here. There's some kind of universal collapse. But let's ask ourselves then, if we're not to understand this through just our imagination, or just through, well, I think it means this, let's ask ourselves, how is these statements from Jesus, how are they biblically informed? Where do they come from? How do we understand them? Well, the fact is we must understand a very important text. All right, there's a very important text in 1 Peter that I've mentioned a couple times. It bears mentioning again. It's 1 Peter 1:11. If we read here from just verses 10 to 12, Peter says, concerning this, or concerning our salvation, the prophets who prophesied about the grace that was to be yours searched and inquired carefully. Verse 11, now listen to this. Inquiring what person or time the Spirit of Christ in them was indicating when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the subsequent glories, or the glories to follow, some translations say. It was revealed to them that they were not serving themselves, but you. Now, get this. Peter tells us that the prophets who prophesied of the sufferings of Christ, the glories to follow, it was the Spirit of Christ in them. Now, the question is, if it was Jesus himself, by his Spirit prophesying through these disciples, why would he choose a completely different mode of speech in the New Testament to describe his coming? All right? Now, a very good quote here from Christian author Andrew Perriman. It's on page 153 in the book. And again, the book that we're working from is my recently published book, The Threshold of Exile. And I'd really like to see you guys pick up a copy of this. It's not expensive. It's very informative. I'm not out to make $1 million, and I'm sure that I won't. But it takes... We're expanding on the book quite a bit here, but it's going to keep you in line with the basic ideas that I'm presenting through these podcasts, and you'll be helping out a poor author. But listen, there's this wonderful quote by Christian author and teacher Andrew Perriman, and he says, there's no reason to think that Jesus, as a first century Jewish prophet with a familiarity and inclination toward apocalyptic imagery, was suddenly playing by an entirely different set of linguistic rules, or language rules. I don't see anything in the Gospels, the synoptic Gospels, he says, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to suggest that the writers of the Gospels thought Jesus made a significant break from his natural biblical Jewish context. Historically, it is reasonable to assume that he used language, including prophetic and apocalyptic language, like other Jews of his time. So Jesus, on twofold, both as the Spirit of Christ in the disciples, or in the prophets, who spoke the same form of language, the same form of speech, as well as a man very familiar with the normal conventions and descriptions of apocalyptic language that was familiar with his contemporaries. Okay, so let's ask ourselves, just how did these prophets describe things? How did they speak? Now, very importantly, with specific reference to this verse, I'm going to give a couple of examples here because I want they relate specifically to this this particular context of the day of the Lord and in the sky darkening and the stars falling and all these things happening. The first is Isaiah 13, which we've read I think a couple of times, but I really want to read it again. Verses 9 to 17. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. Sound familiar? Of course, it's exactly what Jesus is quoting here in Matthew 24. The prophet goes on to say, I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant and lay low the pompous pride of the ruthless. I will make the people more rare than fine gold and mankind than the gold of Ophir. Therefore, I will make the heavens tremble. Remember, he says here that the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And he says, I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth, or better yet, the land, because he's speaking about Babylon here, will be shaken out of its place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts in the day of his fierce anger. Now look at the time text. I'm going to drop down to verse 17. That all sounds like the end of the world. It sounds like quote-unquote judgment day. But look what Isaiah says, and this is what we call a time text, okay? It's the text of the time parameter that informs us as to what this prophecy is referring to. He says, Behold, I am stirring up the Medes against them, and Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. And so here, this shaking, okay, and then stars going out, and these we talked about early on about how Jacob understood when Joseph had a dream about the sun, moon, and stars bowing down to him, that Jacob immediately understood that he was talking about clan rulership. He was talking about himself and his wife and Joseph's brothers as clan leaders for the nation of Israel, the whole clan of Israel. And so there's always this association with rulership, leadership, laws, economies, societies, powers, okay, great power transitions into heaven. And here we see that what's happening in this text is that the Medes, the Cyrus and the Persian Empire are going to overthrow Babylon and become the supreme power in the civilized world in the Mideast. And this would happen in the 6th century BC, okay? And so I think that would be the 5th century BC, around 536. So then and again, now there's another interesting text in Ezekiel 32:7 in a prophecy against Egypt. He says, when I blot you out, I will cover the heavens and make their stars dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give its light. And again, this is a prophecy against Egypt, okay, that occurred centuries ago in God's judgment against them through, I believe it was Assyria, it might have been Babylon, but I believe it was Assyria. But I want to pay some very close attention to these two prophecies because number one, Babylon, and we're going to get into this later on. Some of you may have heard this before, but Babylon actually, to my understanding, and I'm going to demonstrate that when we get into the book of Revelation, that Babylon in the book of Revelation is actually the ancient city of Jerusalem. The fall of Babylon is the fall of Jerusalem. And there's this connection with Israel to Babylon. Remember, Israel's roots were in Babylon. Abraham was called out of Ur of the Chaldeans, out of Babylon, okay? And when the Jews when Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came and destroyed the city, the Jews were exiled to Babylon, and Babylon became the center of Jewish life and the place where many of their greatest, most holy books, the Babylonian Talmud, was written. So there's this connection, this link between Israel or Jerusalem and Babylon that's found in the scriptures. But there's also another one, and that is with Egypt, where we are told in Revelation 11:8 that this city where the Lord was crucified is also called, spiritually referred to as, Sodom and Egypt. And so these texts that Jesus is referring to, these descriptions of fall, are being applied to Jerusalem's fall in the first century. Okay, it is and that is the context of the discourse. The discourse is about Jerusalem's fall. This is what we saw from the very beginning. Jesus said that not one stone here is going to be found upon another, and he goes on to describe the conditions in the empire, and then ultimately the conditions in Jerusalem and Judea, which would bring about this great tribulation and ultimate destruction of the city. And here Jesus is describing that in terms, in prophetic language. This language never deals with the destruction of the universe. Even the Jews understand such language. Listen to this marvelous quote. This is by a quote that I've got. And by the way, I should point out these quotes that I read to you. I've done due diligence. They're in my book. I've gotten permission from the authors and the different writers to use this material, so I don't want you to think I'm just stealing it. But Rabbi Jack Abramowitz, who is the Torah content editor at the Jewish Orthodox Union, and this is not with reference to Jesus. This is just simply a Jewish rabbi. But listen to what he says. He says, if you hear someone speaking a language you've never heard before, you would still recognize the sounds coming out of his mouth as speech. But in the stranger's language, you may perceive a word here or there that sounds like words in your own language. Not only might these words mean different things to the two of you, that particular set of syllables might mean the exact opposite to each of you. For example, to table a discussion in American English means to put it aside, while in British English, it means to deal with it. Go figure. Now, the Rambam, and that's the short name or nickname for Maimonides, who was a influential 12th century AD Jewish scholar. Maimonides tells us is what many people experience when reading the words of the prophets. They either don't understand their words or they completely misconstrue them. For example, to describe the downfall of a kingdom, Isaiah employs such metaphors as the stars have fallen, the heavens have been overthrown, the sun has gone dark. Sometimes the prophets refer to mankind, even though they're only speaking of the inhabitants of a particular land, as God will remove man to far away in Isaiah 6:12, and I will cut off man from the earth in Zephaniah 1:3, even though these verses are only speaking of the kingdom of Judah. When Isaiah foretells the downfall of Nebuchadnezzar, that's our text, he says such things as the stars of the heaven and the constellations will not give their light, the sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not let her light shine on it. He also says, I will shake the heavens and the earth will be removed from its place. And the Rambam, or Maimonides, asks, is anyone so foolish, so willfully ignorant, so enamored of literalism that they would take such verses to mean that when Babylonia fell, the nature of the sun, moon, and stars changed, or that the earth changed orbits? Clearly, these are metaphors. These phrases speak to the bitterness of the conquered nation, not to a fundamental change in the fabric of the universe. People, we need to understand this. We need to get our head around this, that this is the way the prophets of old described things, okay, in a very dramatic and with hyperbole and with these dramatic images, because, in the book I use the point that sometimes prose, just this narrative explanations of things, is just simply not adequate, okay? It's just not adequate to describe these great earth-shattering events. I'm going to jump ahead of myself here and read something which follows that. And this is from Psalm 18, which is also 2 Samuel 22, and I'm reading from 2 Samuel 22. And in verse 8, okay, well, we'll just pick it up about verse 5. It's David says that the waves of death encompassed me, and the torrents of destruction assailed me, and the cords of Sheol entangled me, and the snares of death confronted me. In my distress I called to the Lord, and my God I called. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry came to his ears. And the earth reeled and rocked, and the foundations of the heavens trembled and quaked because he was angry. And smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth, and glowing coals flamed forth from him. He bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew. He was seen on the wings of the wind. He was seen on the wings of the wind. He made darkness around him his canopy, thick clouds and gathering of water out of brightness before him. Coals and fire flamed forth, and the Lord thundered from the heavens, and the Most High uttered his voice, and he sent out arrows and scattered them, lightning and routed them. There's that lightning reference again, okay, of God coming like lightning. The channels of the sea were seen, and the foundation of the world were laid bare at the rebuke of the Lord, at the breath of his nostrils. Whew, wow. But look what David is describing. In verse 1, chapter 22, verse 1 of 2 Samuel, and David spoke to the Lord the words of this song on the day when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. All of this language, all of this description, why is it so powerful? Why is it so descriptive? Why does it have so much hyperbole? Because there's a transition, a power transition that we can't see. See, the kingdom is being rent from an evil king, self-serving King Saul, and it's being handed over to David, the forefather of the Lord Jesus, you see. And from the heavenly perspective, this is how God is reacting. This is how God is making something happen in the unseen world as powers are being removed and influences are being removed. And David is being exalted and put into a place of kingship because he's the man after God's own heart, the one from whom the Lord Jesus will come, you see. And so these things cannot be adequately described with just mere prose, and then this happened, and then that happened. That kind of mundane language is just not enough to describe things that are going on in these heavenly realms, okay? And so Jesus uses this kind of language to show that Jerusalem is being destroyed, you see, and in this destruction of Jerusalem and the fall from their place in the heavens, and it's even found in, we should probably look real quickly at Lamentations. I'm not getting very far, but it's okay. This is good stuff, and it needs attention, okay? Let's look for very quickly at Lamentations. Yeah, of course, Lamentations is about the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon, and the prophet Jeremiah is lamenting the state of things and what has happened to the holy city of God and the people of God. And in Lamentations chapter 2 and verse 1, we read from the prophet says, how the Lord in his anger has set the daughter of Zion under a cloud. You notice that cloud covering the darkness? And then he says he's cast down from heaven to earth the splendor of Israel, and he has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. You see, here we go. He's cast out. Israel's place was in the heavens. It's just like Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 2 that Jesus has taken us from, the bondage of sin and seated us in the heavenly places. It's a positioning in the kingdom of God. It's a positioning in the economy of the world. Israel had this place of being in heaven with God, a heavenly people, and here with the destruction of the city and the temple and the fall of the nation in 586 BC, Jeremiah describes that he's cast down from heaven to earth, the splendor of Israel, and he's not remembered his footstool. By the way, just as a side note, you notice something? What is his footstool? It's the land of Israel. It's not the planet. When Isaiah 66:1 says, heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool, he's not talking about the globe. He's saying the heaven is my throne, the land is my footstool. And that's the covenantal domain. And that is, I can't get into this at length now, but I do in my book, my previous book on Zechariah, where, you know, the pillars of the temple are described, the entranceway into the Holy of Holies. Meredith Kline describes that as an anthropomorphic, that means having human form, as the legs of God, the entrance into the netherworld below the throne of God. And so we see this whole imagery of God seated in heaven, but his feet planted on the land of Israel in the covenantal domain. Okay, these are glorious, phenomenal images, church, that we need to learn how to reread our Bible anew and get out of this wooden literalistic mentality and just appreciate the poetic form and the descriptive form with which these things are described in the Bible. I'll tell you what, folks, thank you for tuning in. We're going to cut this off right here, and then next week we'll finish these thoughts, and we'll get into Matthew 24:30. God bless you. Thank you for tuning in, and take care.